Hello, gorgeous people, and welcome to another TV Central one-on-one podcast. I'm Aaron Ryan. This is episode 25, 2024. Born in 1944, Ray Martin is one of Australia's most recognisable faces. As an award-winning journalist with a career spanning 6 decades, he has traversed the globe interviewing world leaders, medical pioneers, and Hollywood's A-list. Ray was one of the first journalists on to sign on to the primetime investigative series 60 Minutes throughout the 1970s and 80s. He presented daily flagship programs A Current Affair and Midday. And throughout the 90s, he's also won 5 Gold Logies, is an appointed member of the Order of Australia, and has appeared on postage stamps as part of the Legends of Australian television series. At the age of 79, he now faces the last great unknown. As he approaches his own closing chapters, he considers how he might be laid to rest and asks the question of Australia's wider society: how do we as a nation handle death? Ray Martin, The Last Goodbye, is a 3-part documentary series for SBS, which begins Wednesday, 14th of August. The Australian icon and beloved journalist Ray Martin has stopped by for a chat. Ray Martin from Ray Martin, The Last Goodbye. Thank you for joining me at TV Central.
Hello rather than goodbye.
That's right. If you are 79, that makes you about 4 years away from the average death in Australia. In fact, being male, it's 81.2. So I suppose you knew this going in that this would be close to home. As you worked your way through the doco, did it ever come too personal?
Don't think so. Excuse my voice. The moment I've got a pill, but no, I don't think so. It was only I'm almost in denial. One of the reasons I did it was out of curiosity. When it was BBC produced it, and I thought I'd like to go and have a look at death as it's seen in cultural Australia amongst this rich tapestry of Australians, and so we did look at that. We looked at everything from Islamic funerals to Samoan funerals to Mexicans to the Irish wake, which was sort of closer to home for me. So I just really went on as this will be interesting, and it turned out to be quite fascinating.
I thought 2 things were supposed to be certain in the series: death and taxes. Perhaps death is not so certain after watching this doco. Do you find people reaching for immortality to be fanciful or fascinating?
Yeah, I think it's fanciful. It's fascinating in the sense of wealthy Americans, especially, who are into all kinds of antidotes, if you like, to try and stave off death and assure longevity or assure eternity. And I keep reading the billionaires who are transplanting or transferring blood and all kinds of elements to the body to try and live the extra 100 years. Of course, within the show itself, we looked at cryonics or cryogenics, and that is available in Australia, one of the few places, probably half a dozen now around the world, where you could pay, in this case, $150,000 per person to be basically put in a cryo position and plucked out of the tube in 100 years' time. Now, again, that's the people we spoke to involved in that are highly intelligent, good salesmen, if you like, but to me that seems to be fanciful, to say the least.
Highly intelligent, but perhaps with too much money. You do explore every facet of death. No gravestone unturned. So I had to throw in that pun. Some of it, I don't think I could ever remember being explored at all on television. Why a warts and all approach? Or I suppose it's going to, if you're going to talk about death, you might as well go deep. I ask that because it may be confronting for some.
Yeah, I looked at one episode yesterday with the BBC staff who hadn't seen the program, and this was probably 100 people or 80 people, and I was surprised when it was over. Probably most of the women had tears. I'm not sure about the men, but the women certainly talked to me about how moving it had been. Having done it for 4 months and followed the subject from around the world, almost certainly around Australia, I was I'd sort of lived with it for all that time, and I didn't see the emotional side of it perhaps as much as I should have. But that surprised me that these are young people not facing death themselves, really, at least as far as they think, and they were moved by it. So it is one of those subjects that I found more questions, for example, amongst people your age and people my age. When I've talked about it, people simply say, "What are you doing? Have you retired?" And I say, "Well, no, heaven forbid." But I say no, and then what are you doing? And I somewhat hesitantly have said, "Oh, look, I'm doing a series on death." And people of your age and my kids' ages, friends of theirs, are really filled with questions about not just about the spirit world, but how it's done and how the culture's changed from one part of Australia to another.
Yeah. There are certain jobs where you have to be, I guess, a certain kind of person to do that job. Mortician surely has to be one of those jobs, undressing and dressing a dead body, sort of sculpting their face and lines so they look as natural as possible, etc. You've spoken to some morticians. What did you find? Just an everyday person, or someone that's a bit eccentric?
Yeah, the mortician we spoke to, Lance, works at the university in one of the science departments, and if you like, freelances, has done for about 30 years as a mortician. He's very normal and very together and very funny. Again, I think to do it for that long, you'd have to have a good sense of humour to deal with death as closely as he has to do it. I've also spoken to hangmen over the years and other stories I've done. Now that's a really weird profession. I can't imagine someone going home at night and talking about their job. But a
Sure.
mortician, similarly, he's a bit of an artist in what he's doing. He's not a scientist. I think his day job is science, and the night job is being an artist and in making people look as normal and in some cases as beautiful as he possibly can. And he sees it as very much the way someone, a gardener works the flowers, or someone else works in a pottery. And so it's interesting, from that point of view. You don't do it for 30 years unless you've got a certain fascination with it. No, I don't mean for a moment that was a bizarre fascination, but he really was conscious that he had a job which was intended to make people look their best and to actually make other family members comfortable at a fairly emotional time. So he was fantastic. I couldn't believe, and again, a fairly wicked sense of humour.
Yeah, yeah, interesting guy. You would need a sense of humor in that. You mentioned in the doco that most people have not spoken about their funeral, who they would want there, who will speak, etc. Is that something that most people should think about? I mean, I guess I'm one of those people that says if I'm dead, I won't be there. So do what you want.
Yeah, I think that's very common. That's probably why we don't talk about it enough. In other cultures, certainly such as the Islamic and even the Mexican culture with the Day of the Dead every year in November, they are conscious that the death is part of life, and that in fact, dying is part of living, and therefore there is always a member of the family and hopefully an elderly person in the family who's going to pass away, and therefore you prepare for that, which is probably why we look after the elderly in those societies better than perhaps we do in Australia these days. But they were certainly, as I say, when the family in the documentary who were Mexican Australians, one thing for the Mexican father who'd been raised in this particular part of their culture as a child and as he grew up. But their three children are new age men and women who are in, I think, high tech and university educated and highly intelligent and pretty hip. And yet they subscribe to this day of death in which you put a bit of if you like, the candles up for the dead grandparents or the dead uncles and aunts and those sorts of things. And you leave some food for them and you leave some petals there, and you expect the spirits will arrive and say good day on that night. Now, that's one thing for some old uneducated bloke to, not that this man is like that, but in the past you tend to think, well, that's how churches keep people hoodwinked about heaven and hell. That wasn't the case. These were young, intelligent, withered, bright men and women, and they subscribed to this part of the culture. And I found that really, I thought it was really warm and encouraging that there was no dismissal of dad's silly old beliefs or that sort of stuff. They believe that with the grandchildren there as well, this is all part of who they were and how they live and die.
Episode 2 looks at our places of rest and the environmental ramifications. I never thought about environmental factors. Can you explain how our burials might affect the environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was probably one of the most powerful discoveries. That generally you go to somewhere like Rookwood in Sydney, and that's the biggest crematorium in the world, and or biggest cemetery rather in the world, including a crematorium. And that's just they're running out of space in the areas like the Jewish part of the cemetery and the Muslim part of the cemetery, where they bury people rather than cremate them. In the Chinese part, they're running out of space, and so the requirement for machines to come and mow the lawns and tend the flowers and keep the roads going, all that sort of stuff for basically a vast amount of space, like in a city of 1 million people almost, or bodies. That environmentally takes a lot of effort, and it burns a lot of fuel, and it takes a lot of space, and they're running out of space there. And you look at that, and mostly, I'm not exaggerating, mostly if you get 3 generations from when the body was put in the ground with the headstone there, the headstones are falling over or started to have fallen over. And so it becomes, clearly in today's society, we don't really care too much about great-great-grandmother who passed away 100 years ago. And they tend to be, they're important at the time, but you tend to think, well, that's not a place you go. And therefore, why are we keeping that space, and why are we spending the money and upkeep and in a cemetery and so where people don't really go. Now, when it comes to the crematorium, again, you discover it at 700 degrees, the furnace, if you like, the violence of the flames that get rid of bodies and parts of and whiskey bottles and and wooden golf sticks and stuff that are stuck in coffins with people that are buried with these days and then burnt. And again, is like, I think the amount of energy they use there is like a flight from Perth to Sydney. And if you're
Wow.
concerned about the, you don't do that. So each time it happens, and most Australians prefer to be cremated rather than buried. Most Americans prefer to be buried, and they're heavily into it also into preparing the bodies and even saving the bodies in a lot of American culture. And that's again the upkeep on that and the amount of air that we use and special parts of our environment that are taken up, as against what you would have then seen. We go to somewhere like the mulch, the idea of a new technique that's come out of Seattle in Northwest America, and that to me was the most sensible of the lot up to that point. That was the idea that you might put the dead body into a tube, and you put in there certain herbs and certain other soil parts that they actually decompose the body more quickly, and so you end up with a small hilux, if you like, of soil with what's been put in there and the rest of the body soil, and that can be used obviously to embellish a corner of the yard or some other part in the park. And the woman who devised that, I thought was probably the most, from my way of thinking, environmentally the best thing we could do. And the body is decomposed fairly quickly, and it becomes a part where you might have a flowering bush or a beautiful tree, and that's the memory of grandpa or grandma rather than simply sort of scattered to the winds. And that turned out to be over and over again. The crew that I was with, all thought that was the best thing we had seen, and yet it hasn't appeared in Australia. The idea of having a body as compost, but the woman who had invented it, who was a very smart architect who changed careers and is now in this body composting period. She was saying, I'd love to tell you that what we have in the back of that truck, which is your compost, I'd love to tell you that it's especially nutritional, if you like, biologically. But she said it's not. It's just like really a bag of butter from Bunnings. It's not much more nutritious than that. But nevertheless, I would figure that that my body was not adding to the harm to the environment, which is happening in my lifetime. So I wouldn't like to be part of that. But the other option, of course, was in Western Victoria. I think the only place in the world where we went there, which they're burying the bodies in basically a post hole digger comes along and makes a fairly narrow hole, and the body, it goes deeper rather than across, as we normally see a burial site. And they've got, I think, probably 100 people in the ground there in a public burial place, a public cemetery, and they can fit 10 times as many people in there as you could in a standard cemetery. So it's that sort of copies. The devil's in the detail, of course, Aaron, and the detail of these various things is really quite fascinating, which is what I, as a journalist, I found quite compelling.
As you reflect over your career covering the continent, seeing every facet of the human race from politics to war, human interest, stories, and death, what is your view of humanity as a whole?
Wow, big question. My view is that I'm a lapsed Catholic, and therefore I really, I personally am of the belief that it's dust to dust. That what you and I are doing, this is not a dress rehearsal. There's only one go around in this. And yet I'm not an atheist because I have met, and for this series as well, I've met people in my life who are far more intelligent than me, men and women, and they are believers. And no matter whether it be a Christian faith or other faith, they believe in a spirit world and believe in afterlife and things like that I don't. And I'm not arrogant enough to say they're wrong and I'm right. They're obviously seeing something, and these are not people who are easily deluded or easily won over by some, silver-tongued priest or preacher. And so they're seeing something that I don't see. The seven great religions of the world all involve a spirit world. And these aren't simply just talking to, uneducated mobs who'll go along for the ride, depending on what the silver-tongued devil up in the pulpit says. So I'm still in that sense an atheist. An agnostic, not an atheist. But I just believe there's something there that I don't know about, and therefore I would, in the meantime, I wish I could find out. But my feeling is that the only people who tell us about heaven and hell and maybe purgatory in the old days are always people who've never been there. They don't come back and tell us that it's a good place. And I think, as Mark Humphrey said to us, in the comedian in the dinner we had, I'm not sure we used that, but he said, I just want someone to come back and say, yeah, it's a hot place, or it's a beautiful place where they have violins and champagne, that sort of stuff. And I think that's the case. Having talked to Kerry Packer, who was dead for 8 minutes, told me once, there's no bright light out there. That no matter what you think, there's no bright light. And yet one of the women we spoke to in the series you saw was dead for about 15 minutes in the water at Coogee, when she had an epileptic seizure. And she's an awful long time. She's a lawyer today and extremely bright, extremely switched on. She said she had a sort of peace there, that almost like a dreamlike state, when she was dead for about 15 minutes, but was conscious of things going on around her. Another man I spoke to over the years, who was a farmer who had no romance in the soul at all, and was not religious at all. About again, he said he had this vision of three men, a blazing light, and three men like a panel up there talking to him. Now, I'm not arrogant enough to say you're deluded, you don't know what was happening, and clearly you're making that up, because I wouldn't say that. And so people have different experiences and different beliefs. But as I say, I don't have the intellectual arrogance to say a true believer is wrong and I'm right.
Mm. When I spoke to Liz Hayes and asked her to reflect on her career, it wasn't the big celebrities or the war zones or even the major breaking stories, but it was reflecting on those personal humanity stories. What stories have remained in your heart and mind after all these years?
Oh, it's so many. I mean, I've done almost 60 years now, but oddly enough, I'm just heading back to Aceh, where I was 20 years ago when the tsunami hit Aceh. And I'm in preparing that. We're going back to talk, hopefully, to some of the people we spoke to then who'd been to hell and back, because that was, 200,000 people were killed in Aceh, or in that province of Indonesia. And I'd never seen that sort of devastation of the spirit as well as the physical landscape. And what stunned me about that was, people who'd been, as I say, lost everything. Most of those we spoke to had lost multiple family members. They'd lost the people most precious to them in their lives, their wives and children and mothers and fathers and so on. And yet they wanted to share what little rights they had with us there, because that's having the milk of human kindness. And so that staggered me, just how decent these people who, as I say, had been to hell and back, were in trying to be civil and social and polite, and were Australians, servicemen who were military and who were Army and Navy. One group of engineers, the Army Corps of Engineers from Darwin, sorry, who were ockers, who were rough as guts, blokes who were soldiers, and they were providing water to the Archenese people. Otherwise, they would have all been, died or had terrible diseases. And they had to work for about 36 hours to get these machines going, and then to get to purify the water. And the Indonesian men and women, mostly men, were lining up with plastic bottles to get the water. And these Australian soldiers um, went out of their way to learn some Archinese so that they could say good morning to them, or how are you, or I hope you're happy. And they muttered in their Aussie lingo these Archinese words, and they smiled and they patted them into the shoulders and wished them well and so on. And I thought, how bloody good are you? How fantastic you blokes. And the men in the Navy as well, who were shipped ashore, and they were in the gutters with big shovels and with brooms cleaning up the gutter so water would flow, and etc. etc. And I think the local people were too devastated, too shattered to do those fairly mundane jobs. And the Australian blokes were doing it with a laugh and with a bit of a joke amongst themselves, and saying something polite to them otherwise. So I thought on both sides, the victims, if you like, and the liberators were showing that human element that we don't often see. We don't, and you put it under pressure enough in a trauma like that, which is, as I say, as bad as anything I've ever seen. I think the best of human beings come out, and it's not about the leaders and the prime ministers or presidents. And that sounds, goody two shoe stuff, and it sounds like, yes, you would say that, but in fact, as I prepare to go back to Arche, that's my strongest memory, is of people being civil and decent and caring and kind.
Well, you are 79 and you're still in our living rooms with this new series. You are considering death, but before that, have you considered retirement, or are you happy taking projects that are meaningful to you?
Yeah, certainly happy doing that. Also, I think old men tend to die when they stop working, and there I don't have the intention of dying. I'm here eternally, of course. But I did a series of 30 shows with David Attenborough, who's now
Wow.
97, not 79, and I did. I was riding shotgun with him for these live shows around Australia and New Zealand, and he is my sort of role model in the sense that he's still smart and still tells stories and still likes to drink, and is still very funny, but is still curious. It's that thing that old men don't do. Old women tend to do it better, but old men lose their curiosity and stop asking questions, and also stop listening. And David does all of those things. So I was lucky enough to fall into his orbit, if you like, a few years ago, and he's very strong, sitting on my shoulder, saying, "Yeah, so A, don't give in, but B, don't give up. It's life much too fun for that. Leave that
Yeah,
for boring people."
yeah, another legend he is. Finally, 60 Minutes, A Current Affair, Midday, Sunday, First Contact, At Home Alone Together, and of course, covering major news events. How would you like to be remembered?
How would I like to be remembered? Oh, it's not really a big issue in my life. I mean, I'd obviously like my kids and my wife to have positive things about me, but otherwise, you're in the lap of the gods. Especially social media is such where I read stuff and hear stuff on social media that I think is appalling, and therefore you have no answer back. When I was on television regularly, I could at least, and I'm fairly thin-skinned, so I could at least hit back. Someone said something which was just categorically wrong. It's very hard for social media to do that. So I'm not sure that it's nice when I go to a supermarket, to go to the newspaper store, and a stranger says something nice to me about my coverage of news, and that's good for the moment. But in the long term, that doesn't really matter. I mean, what matters is people who know you or people who love you, who care about you. So generally, how would I like to be remembered? Probably just as things I've done that you talk about. I would have done them for nothing, in a sense that I've just loved them. If you're lucky enough to get a job that you adore, that you just love doing, that you do anyway for free, then you're a lucky man. You won the lottery. So in that
Mm.
sense, I simply I can't. Honestly, without being too insincere about this, I can't believe the luck, even in doing this series, that the BBC comes along and says, "How'd you like to do a series about death?" And I think, yeah, that'd be fantastic. What can I find out about that? And so, in some ways, my criticism of my role in this particular series is that I'm such an observer that it's very hard to be a participant. I think probably that sort of show, like reality shows today, require people to participate more than I did. And I just found myself as an observer of 60 years experience, being bedazzled by the Samoan funeral,
Mm.
being impressed by the warmth of the Islamic funerals and the washing of bodies and so on and so on. So all the time I found on a subject that I really wasn't very familiar or wasn't expert on, that I thought, geez, that's interesting. Oh wow, I didn't know that. And that's probably what keeps someone younger than they should.
Well, Ray, from a viewer point of view, you'll be remembered for your curiosity, your commitment to uncovering truth, your authenticity, your ability to be just one of us, while sometimes being in places and situations none of us could ever comprehend. Being hugely likable for being truthful and being able to stick to your convictions and morals, but at the same time being open and inquisitive of the human condition, and for just being a true blue Aussie legend. Ray Martin, thank you for joining me at TV Central.
I couldn't have written that better myself. Thank you very much.
Did that all by myself. And that wraps up our conversation with legendary journalist and Aussie icon Ray Martin. Don't miss his new documentary, Ray Martin, The Last Goodbye, premiering on SBS and SBS On Demand from Wednesday, the 14th of August. It's a powerful reminder of the incredible impact Ray has on our lives, and we certainly hope it's not his last goodbye. Here's to many more great years ahead. Well, that's it for another TV Central 101 podcast. For the latest television news, streaming info, podcast, head to tvcentral.com.au. But for now, I'm Aaron Ryan. Thanks to Ray Martin. Bye for now.